Thank you guys.
Thanks so much, Allison. And Katie and I want to thank everybody from the East Hampton Library, Dennis, Sheila, Stephen, Carrie, and thank you all for being here tonight. So welcome. It's actually a perfect day in East Hampton. It's really misty out, so it's a perfect day to be discussing murder, mystery, and miracles. And I'm Carrie Doyle, and I'm in East Hampton now, and I'm the author of the Hampton Murder Mystery Series, which is set in East Hampton about a fictional inn. And my fourth book in the series, Death on Bullpath, comes out next week from Source Books. And I'm so excited to talk all things about my aunt, Katie Mahon, who has had some incredible experiences in her life. Just to give you a little bit of Katie's bio, she is the co-author of 2 books about miracles. And her curiosity on the subject is prompted by a harrowing experience she had at 19 that's haunted her basically her entire adult life. And stay tuned, she'll be telling you that. So her most recent book, The Miracle Collectors, Uncovering the Stories of Wonder, Joy, and Mystery, was published a few weeks ago by Hachette. We're going to talk about that in her book. Hopefully East Hampton Library has her book as well as my books, but also if you're in the Hamptons, Bookhampton carries books, and or go to your local library, or in this day and age, Barnes & Noble can be considered an independent bookstore too. So check that out as well, please. And prior to embarking on Katie's spiritual quest, she was a banker and a passionate volunteer for any cause related to women's health and children's education. So she's currently living in New York City in East Hampton, but she's a transplant from the San Francisco Bay Area where she grew up. And she's a board member of Poets and Writers. And she has this latest book, which I'm excited to tell you about. So Katie, welcome and thanks for being here tonight with me.
Carrie, thank you. Thank you for organizing the event at the East Hampton Library. Thank you to the East Hampton Library. And I thought to get us started, I wanted to just mention about Carrie's books. I've read 2 of the 4 in the Hamptons Murder Mysteries. They're wonderful, fun whodunits. And actually, I just started the 3rd one. But what I don't know the answer to, so I'm kind of intrigued, is how, Carrie, you got interested in the murder mystery genre. Like, what experience in your own life prompted you to pursue that? And also, I'm kind of wondering whether Antonia, the protagonist who I love, and she's a total foodie, and I do know that you a long time ago worked for Ina Garten, and I just wondered if that, had anything to do with why Antonia is obsessed with food. And I kind of feel like I hear your voice whenever she's, talking in these books, which I love.
Well, definitely both my protagonist, Antonia, is obsessed with food as I am. Yes. And so I'll say, everything obviously in fiction comes somehow from your real life. So yes, I worked in college. My sister and I worked at the Barefoot Contessa store in East Hampton, which was an incredible experience. Ina Garten was a wonderful boss to work for. As you can imagine, it can sometimes be a tough crowd in there. As my sister Liz, who worked with me, said, the worst crowd is the people who are entitled, rich, and hungry. So they would come into the store and want their food right away. And it could be difficult, but Ina was amazing. She really had her employees' backs, and she was calming presence and a wonderful person to work for. So that was an amazing experience. And so yes, part of my protagonist, Antonia Bingham, is based on Ina Garten. But in terms of murder, it's sort of those things where you have these experiences in life and you're like, did that really happen? And yes, it really happened. So when I was growing, I've always been interested in murder, but when I was growing up, and I grew up in New York City in an apartment building, and my upstairs neighbor in the 80s, he would go jogging with O.J. Simpson, who, in the 80s was the biggest celebrity. And our doorman would not ring up O.J. Simpson, would not tell our upstairs neighbor that he'd arrived. And we always thought, why is he not doing that? And he refused to do it, and it caused some friction with the person above me and the doorman, why he wasn't doing that. And one day my sister asked the doorman, said, why don't you ring him up? And he said, I saw him beat his wife up outside our building. I don't want to bring this guy up. I don't like this guy. And we were totally suspicious about this. But then years later, obviously we know what happened, sadly, to Nicole Brown Simpson. But there was a documentary 4 years ago on ESPN, Made in America, about O.J. Simpson. And for the first time, they showed Nicole Brown Simpson's diaries. And on one page, she writes about the first time that OJ ever hit her was outside of this person's building. He beat her up. So it actually was true. And just being in that close proximity made me totally obsessed with that OJ Simpson murder. Not to mention that then another doorman, not the same one, killed his wife and went to prison for 25 years, you can imagine. But so all these sort of cases, when you're sort of living, especially in New York, you never know who you're walking by, and you have these experiences, and it like changes the course of your life and your interests in what you're involved in. And I think, Katie, you personally have had some, I mean, you were not naturally on the path of miracles, and you had some experiences that have caused your interest.
Well, true. And, you know, people ask, how did you get involved in this whole topic of miracles? It's not exactly the job you dream about as a kid. So, you know, it wasn't on the list of options that I imagined. And but as you mentioned, I had an experience when I was 19 that, you know, has really haunted me my entire adult life. And some people called it a miracle. And I eventually went down that spiritual path that maybe was a possibility. But initially I was kind of like Moses, who supposedly had a stutter and asked God to pick somebody else to be the spokesperson for the Israelites. You know, I was kind of dragged into it, but then I completely and fully embraced it.
Okay, so time to tell us the story. And let me just tell you this story, every time I tell people this story, they get chills. They literally every time say, I get chills. This is an incredible story. So tell us what happened to you when you were 19.
So the summer after my freshman year, okay, whose phone is that? I just heard some phone ringing. Okay. The summer after I was my freshman year in college, and it was the summer of 1975. I was 19, and I worked at a job that was from 7 a.m. till 3 p.m. And so I had these set hours, and I lived across the bay in a town called Tiburon, and I took the ferry to work and back. And the first ferry home was at 4 o'clock. So I always had this hour to kind of kill and make my way to the ferry boat. And this one particular day, I was standing on the corner of Stockton and Geary, where there was this iconic San Francisco wonderful store called I. Magnin. And anybody who knew San Francisco back in the day, you know, the gold and pink striped boxes from I. Magnin was like, you know, just a wonderful thing to receive. And I was standing in front looking at their beautiful windows when a man walked up. He was really clean cut. He told me that he was a stranger in town and that he needed some help. He'd had eye surgery and he needed to look up his best friend's parents in a phone book. So my instant reaction was, you know, something I'd learned in childhood: don't take candy from a stranger. So I turned to the crosswalk and waited for the light to change. He followed me. He repeated his request as we crossed the street. And when he finished, he was just so persistent and charming. And when he finished, he said, I'm staying at the Hyatt up the street. You know, can't you please help me out? And so I thought, wow, the Hyatt, you know, is a busy hotel. It was a block away, you know, and it was going to be crowded with people. And so I could put to use another thing I've learned in childhood, which was be a good Samaritan. So the Hyatt's built on a hill. And as I recall, so I told him yes. We walked in a floor below the lobby, and sure enough, there were lots of people milling around. and we got into an elevator. There were other people in the elevator that we took to the lobby level. And then we get to the lobby level and everybody gets out of the elevator, but this man doesn't move. And just as I'm sort of thinking, okay, what do I do? The door's shut and I realize that he's pressed the mezzanine. And I start to feel a little uncomfortable, but I tell myself, okay, the mezzanine's going to be crowded with people. So we get off on the mezzanine and the mezzanine is completely deserted. You know, there's no noise. We walk down this deserted hallway. We make a left-hand turn into a long rectangular conference room. And sure enough, in the back, there's a payphone on the wall. There's a phone book on the shelf beneath it. I walk over to the phone book. I'm facing the wall. The man is standing behind me. And I'm looking for a Brown family that lives on Marina Boulevard. So I start to look down these columns of Browns, and there's many columns. And I would say maybe a minute goes by, and all of a sudden, this wave of complete terror comes over me. And it's not like I went down a checklist. It was this instantaneous realization. There's no patch on this guy's eye. You know, why wouldn't he know the first names of his best friend's parents? And by the way, for you youngsters out there, back in the day, that's how you would look up a common name. You would know that the first name was Richard, and then you just go through the alphabetical order. He had not given me that information, and I had not asked. I was obviously looking for a needle in a haystack, and I was in a situation I'd been taught my whole life not to be in, which is that I'm in this deserted room with this stranger and nobody knows that I'm there. I turned around and this man's entire face had changed. His eyes had gotten dark. And it was as if he knew that I knew. And that was like what he was waiting for. And right then, you know, he starts to move towards me. And at the same time, there's this movement at the door and there's a bellman that walks in. And this bellman looks me right in the eyes and he says, "Don't you think you should be going now?" Which is kind of a strange thing to say. I walked out of the room with the bellman. The man doesn't follow us. We go down the hallway into an elevator door that's open. We go down to the lobby. I get out. I'm completely shell-shocked. And a few seconds go by. I finally get my wits about me. And I think I should thank this man, this bellman. And, you know, I look to the right and the left and he's nowhere in sight. I went home and I told my mom exactly what happened. And she instantly said to me, "Well, he was an angel." And at the time, I wasn't receptive at all to her response. I wasn't particularly receptive to religion. I wasn't looking for a spiritual explanation for what had happened to me, in fact. And I told very few people. I was really embarrassed by what happened. I felt really stupid. And I told my siblings, I told a handful of friends, I certainly told my husband. And 15 years went by. And in those years, once or twice a year, I'd have this nightmare and this man's face was sort of emblazoned in my brain and I would wake up and my heart would be pounding. Anyway, 15 years went by and it was January of 1989 and Jim, my husband, and I are in bed reading the morning newspaper at night, because that's when you read the morning newspaper when you have two toddlers and work full time. And he turned to me and handed me the front page of the newspaper and said, "Oh my God, Katie, I think this is your guy." And there on the front page was a photograph of Ted Bundy. And my heart went into my throat. I went on to read the articles. His victims were between the age of 19 and 21. They were 5'6" or 5'7". Their hair was long and brown or blonde and parted in the middle. He was a frequent visitor to San Francisco in the mid-1970s when he was at the height of his murder spree. He feigned injury to lure his victims. And so I knew it in my gut that that was the man that I had encountered that day. And the experience really had a profound effect on me. It was hard to accept, but I eventually started down this path. It was kind of this gut check that, you know, maybe I should consider a spiritual explanation for what happened. And then a few years later, Jim, who's from this huge family, and Carrie is the daughter of his sister, Kathy. He's one of 6 kids. And we were at a celebration in Washington, D.C., celebrating their brother's wedding. And we went to a museum, and we were in this coffee shop for the museum, taking a break. And it was really just us, the family, which is to say there were quite a few of us there though. And Jim said, Katie, you know, you've really got to tell everybody your story. So I did. And Carrie, who I thought was so hip and so cool, you know, she looked at me and said, well, the Bellman was an angel. And I thought, it kind of had a different ring coming from her than it did from my Irish Catholic mother years before. Sorry, Mom, may you rest in peace. And I subsequently found out, just as Carrie and I were talking about this event tonight, that I thought that my story, which I knew had always really resonated with her, but I didn't know the full extent as to why that was. So I'm going to turn it back over to Carrie.
Yeah, I mean, Katie, that's an incredible story. Thank you for sharing. And I think everybody who's heard that, it's really unbelievable, especially keep in mind back then, especially when Katie first told me the story, you know, there were not all these TV movies on Ted Bundy. He wasn't such a big deal. There was not the internet and all that, like long when she was doing this. So it was hard to identify him. But so Katie told me this story it was 3 weeks after my dad had died. My dad died when he was 53, and we'd gone to this family wedding. And as she said, we were in the Smithsonian coffee bar. And two things that I remember her saying so clearly is how when she looked at this man, you know, the wave of terror, and she felt like she was face to face with the devil. And then when the bellman walked in and across the room just looked at her, not even at him, and said, don't you think you should be going now? It just felt like someone just pulling her out of this experience. And I right away did think a guardian angel. And it meant a lot to me to think, you know, when someone dies, you're casting around for hopes and reasons or some sort of logic. And something like that just really sparked hope that, okay, maybe there are guardian angels out there. Maybe there are people that, you know, help you along the path. And it's almost going back to being a writer, like when you read a book at a certain time, it really resonates with you. You can read a book at the wrong time. Like I think back to my, you know, when I was in 8th grade, they had us reading Madame Bovary, which is kind of random about, you know, an unhappy housewife or something, like wrong time. But sometimes you read a book or you hear a story at the exact perfect time in your life. And that's a miracle in itself. And so I know that this has led you onto your path about miracles. So tell me how this got you to start writing your books.
So I met up with 2 other moms in the small town we lived east of San Francisco. And it turned out that they also had these extraordinary stories that people called miracles. And we sort of thought, well, what does that mean? You know, we were all these Jesuit educated Catholics, and, you know, we sort of had been taught a particular way, but we wanted to know what are the great faith traditions and, you know, other cultural groups, whatever, you know, have to say on the subject. And so we wrote this first book called The Miracle Chase. And an unexpected consequence happened as we traveled around the country to talk about our first book. We started every talk by telling our 3 stories. And this unexpected thing happened. People came out of the woodwork to tell us theirs, which really surprised us because these stories are personal and they're hard to tell. But we obviously had given people permission and also maybe given them a language to tell these stories. And we realized over the years that we had become the story keepers. And so this second book, The Miracle Collectors, is a collection of these stories that we heard, these gifts, if you will, over the last several years. But the book is more than just stories. It's really a book of possibilities. It takes the reader on a journey with us to look at life through a different lens or with fresh eyes in the company of these extraordinary stories from ordinary people. And we like to say that it empowers others to find the miracles in their own lives. And like you said, Carrie, I think one of the reasons why I think the book is important now is because it does give people hope. These stories give people hope. The book is uplifting at a time when we're all coming out of a really tough year. Some of us, certainly more than others, the tragedy of the loss of loved ones or financial difficulties. I think we've all experienced with our friends or our family that we're not always on the same side, that the country is really polarized. And I think that these stories, share with us that we have a lot in common. And we can all relate to courage and forgiveness and love and a community that lifts people up. And so, these stories really draw on our better angels, if you will. And so, I think that's, what the book offers.
So I agree. And I've actually just recently given the book to someone who lost her husband during this pandemic and said that she was, had heard a song and it was a song they listened to. And she thought, well, maybe that's a little bit of a miracle. And I think one thing you do well as in the book is sort of what is a miracle? It can be different things, but sifting through it, what is your interpretation of a miracle after having heard all these stories and done all this research?
It's a good time to think about miracles because, of course, we have this weekend Passover, which celebrates the miraculous exodus of the Jews from Egypt. And next week is Holy Week. And of course, the biggest miracle in Christianity, which is the resurrection. And I think when certainly we started and were researching miracles, this is what everybody thinks about. They think about the big, bold, biblical in proportion, type of miracle. But what the last 20 years has really taught me is that miracles are really on a continuum. And those big, bold miracles are at one end of this continuum. And at the other end, you've got the coincidence, maybe an eerie coincidence, and hearing a song at exactly the right time, when you really needed to hear it or something like that. I think that that's what we need to understand about miracles, because if you think about them in terms of a coincidence or even a beautiful, spectacular sunset, then you start to recognize that they're available to all of us. They're available to everyone. And for me to really embrace the concept of miracles, I needed to understand that it wasn't just me. You can plot the continuum for me somewhere over there, but it really is that they are available to everyone. And, the Miracle Collectors offers these stories that are personal. They're in the eyes of the beholder. And it just is a path to finding miracles in your own life. And I think that's important.
And I know we've talked a little bit about you being Irish Catholic and religious miracles. Did you ever meet people who said, I had a miracle, but I'm not a religious person. I'm an atheist or anything like, that was seeing miracles another way, in a non-religious way?
I think absolutely. In fact, one of the stories in the book, my friend, well, I won't name my friend, but anyway, one of the stories in the book, she and I went for a walk not too long ago. And, you know, she's not a believer in, certainly not in any kind of traditional notion of God, but she has a story in the book. She would consider herself very spiritual. I also think that miracles can be problematic because there's evil, illness. We live in sometimes a depressing and tragic world. And it's hard, I know for me, it's really hard to be a cheerleader for your own saved life when, you know, Ted Bundy murdered more than 30 women. So how do you, you know, reconcile that? And for me, it's not an easy answer. I mean, part of the answer is faith. And part of the answer is that, you know, it's an unanswerable question that thousands of years of really smart people have been trying to figure out. I think what happens when you see miracles on this continuum, though, is that you have an opportunity to kind of shift your perspective to goodness and positive things that in fact do happen. Because that's really our only option.
So in the book, what are some of your favorite miracle stories that are included in this book?
So a short and sweet story that I really like to repeat. We were in LA and this woman came up to us and she said, I have a story I want to share with you. And she said, you know, she told us what her job was. It was a very male-dominated field. She was very high up, and she didn't think that she could ever approach her boss and ask to work part-time. And she had a real dilemma because she was at the absolute end of her rope. She had 3 children that were 5 and under, and any moms on here can relate to this. And this one day, she just didn't think she could do it any longer, but she didn't want to give up her career and she wanted to be a better mom and, you know, all of that stuff. And so she's driving around doing errands, too many errands in too little time on some Sunday afternoon. And she's got all 3 kids in the back and they're squawking and they're making noise and whatever. And she sends up this prayer and she's just like, God, just tell me what to do. And literally right then, there is this big billboard of a Mexican brewery. And on the billboard was clearly their symbol or whatever, which is Our Lady of Guadalupe, which is the special devotion of the Blessed Mother in Mexico. And underneath in huge letters, it says, just ask. So she thinks, okay, I think I've been told exactly what I need to do. She goes into the office on Monday. She tells her boss, I can't, this is not sustainable. I have to work part-time. And he says, we've kind of been wondering when you were going to come and ask. And yes, you may. And they worked it out. And she, you know, is working part-time. So anyway, that's one of my favorite stories because I think, you know, wouldn't it be great if we could all drive down a freeway, send up a prayer and get our answer, you know, right there in a literal sign.
Right. It's so, like that movie, Bruce Almighty.
Yes, exactly. And so another story that's in the book that I like to talk about because it's really not as neat and tidy. It's a little more complicated. We talk in the first third of the book about becoming aware. And, you know, that sounds like something everybody says, well, I'm aware, you know, whatever. But really being aware takes practice. And I don't think it's as easy as it sounds. And anyway, we were at a book signing in Oakland, in Montclair, California. Lovely independent bookstore that's still there. A great, good place for books, it's called. And it's teeny tiny. But we were there doing this event. And I asked if anybody had any more questions or a story to tell. And I remember thinking at the time, I've got to be aware if somebody actually wants to tell a story and not be so, you know how you want to, especially when you're the speaker, you want to just fill up all the space and, you know, and talk. But I really let the pregnant pause kind of hang in the air longer than I was comfortable. But I'm so glad I did, because this woman, Rebecca, said, I have a story. It's kind of like Katie's. And mind you, her best friend and her 14-year-old daughter were there, and neither of them had ever heard this story before. And she goes on to talk about how she had set up, she, you know, lived in the Georgetown, Washington, D.C. area, and she had set up 2 interviews. She wanted to go into film production, and she had an interview on a Sunday evening. She had an interview on a Monday morning. The interview on the Sunday evening was at 6 o'clock, and her parents, she lived with her parents, and her boyfriend, who later became her husband, they both thought, well, that's really odd, a 6 o'clock interview. And they kind of gave her a hard time about it. And so when he followed up to make sure that she was coming, she neglected to tell anyone sort of where she was going or who she was meeting with. And she shows up at this kind of deserted area of you know, business office complex, which was deserted partly because of the day and the hour. There was a woman that answered the door, but as this man who she directs her to starts to take her around their facilities or whatever, and when she first walks into his office, she sees all these trophies and she thinks, oh, wow, you know, he's a big guy in film production or whatever. And when he takes her on this sort of tour of the facilities, she realizes that it's deserted, and he starts to terrorize her in very sexually explicit ways that she didn't want to repeat in front of her daughter for the better part of an hour. And the entire time she's trying to play his game. He's asking her, is she going to obey him? These are the types of things he does to women who don't obey him. And she figured out pretty early on that she better do what this guy says. And they finally make it back to his office, and she's horrified that nobody knows where she is or who she's with. And they walk in, and she sees that the trophies aren't for film awards, they're for martial arts. And she literally thinks that her life's over. And his phone rings and he doesn't pick it up. And then his phone rings again and he doesn't pick it up. And then the third time his phone rings, in exasperation, he picks it up. And in the course of that short phone call, she hears the person on the other line mention the name of the company that she has the interview with the next day. And she has the wherewithal to say, this is Rebecca, and I have an interview with you, you know, tomorrow, and whatever. And the guy gets off the phone right away. He knows exactly what she's done. He tells her, I've decided to let you go. You better come back, you know, on Monday, or I will ruin your life. And he basically throws her out. She runs to the car. She loses her shoes. She gets back to her parents. She's been gone for 3 hours. They were super worried about her. They call the police. And this turns out to be a serial rapist that they have been trying to capture for 3 years. He's convicted. He goes to prison. The place that she goes to interview with Monday hires her, launches her very successful career. I had an opportunity to interview Rebecca 2 other times as we were thinking about this new book. And what I love about her story is that she actually really taught me something about miracles. And that's that she had a similar response that I did, which is that she somehow felt it was her fault, that she was just really embarrassed that she could be that naive or, you know, whatever. And she said that our talk that night woke something up in her, that she understood that she was sacred body and soul. But then in the most recent conversation, she said, you know, Katie, I really came to understand that I somehow empowered myself to play this guy's game in a way that was like this reverse psychology, that I was, you know, kind of agreeing with everything he said. And she said, I was in a terrifying situation, and the sort of ability to have had my wits about me to that extent and stay calm, she believes is really what the miracle was in the end.
Wow, that's another incredible story. And I mean, you've had also subsequently, recently, a few more stories about people who also, I think someone contacted you whose friends did not escape Ted Bundy, and then someone else who thinks that they might. I think you told me about an airport, someone in the airport who felt they were lured by Ted Bundy.
So, yeah, in fact, yes. So we were on a radio show. We've had quite a few interviews since the publication of the book. And one particular interview, we got a lot of emails, but 4 or 5 of them dealt with Ted Bundy. One, a woman who said all she told me was that she wasn't as lucky as I was, that she did escape him. Another woman told me that she'd been in the San Francisco airport working for TWA back in the 70s when she encountered a similar situation with a man who also said that he had had eye surgery and needed help to look up something in a phone book. Excuse me. And also, the most surprising thing is that the hosts of some of these well-known radio and podcast shows have actually told us their own miracle stories. And I don't know how much time we have left, or Allison, do we have some questions that have come in at this point?
We don't have any questions yet.
I think they need to write it in, right? They needed to write it into the chat room, into the chat.
So
if you have any questions, you can type them into the chat. It's 5:38 right now, so we have a little time.
Okay, so yeah, if people have questions, maybe they could start writing them, and I'll just tell this other story that I know that Carrie doesn't know either, that just happened to me this week, and it involves murder, mystery, and miracles. So Carrie, this is right up your alley.
I love it. Bring it on.
Yeah, so I was talking to this gentleman, this host for a news talk show in the Midwest, and he really wanted to tell me this story. It happened probably 30 years ago. He lived in Nashville with his brother. He was probably in his 20s, I'm guessing. And he was close to his grandparents, his fraternal grandparents. And they took a trip every year to visit his aunt in California. And this particular year, his aunt had a condominium, lived in a condominium that had been broken into a couple of times, and she had decided to move. And so her parents, his grandparents, were driving from Missouri to California to help her move. They knew that she was on a business trip like until Monday, but they arrived on Saturday to stay at her condo and then help her with her move the following week. Well, the Saturday night that they had arrived, this intruder who had broken in before broke in, and very tragically, obviously, bludgeoned to death his grandmother and almost bludgeoned to death his grandfather, but he ended up surviving. They weren't found until the next day by his cousin. But that night, before he was aware of any of these happenings, he was awakened. And at the base of his bed was his grandmother, who told him that everything was going to be okay. And then he said that he understood that grief and tragedy like this can lead people to revenge and hatred. And that he knew that he had to choose differently, that he had to find a way to forgive this man who was arrested, convicted, and went to prison for life. And he was able to do that. And he felt that his ability to forgive was the biggest miracle from this story.
Well, that's really interesting, because I was going to ask you if you had come across miracles that didn't have happy endings, because we think of a miracle as, oh, it's a miracle, I won the lottery, but that's obviously gaining strength from a tragedy. So that's a different sort of miracle, I guess, inner strength, would you say?
Well, I would. And he has said that forgiveness is kind of the leading value of his life. You know, he employs it with, you know, somebody who he's just had cross words with the day before. I mean, it's really important to him that forgiveness is a really big part of his life. And in the Miracle Collectors, we spend an entire chapter on forgiveness. And, you know, I want to add before we maybe get to some questions that one of Joan's, and I think Joan is in the audience somewhere, so I want to give a shout out to my co-author, Joan Louise Hill, that one of our favorite things about this new book, The Miracle Collectors, is that at the end of every chapter, we have these, you know, simple, you know, exercises, if you will, that are called Take a Miracle Moment Challenge. And, you know, one of them, of course, is at the end of the chapter on forgiveness, but they, you know, offer this path to finding miracles in your own life. But I told this radio host at the end of this incredibly powerful story that one of my favorite quotes is an epigraph in front of one of our chapters, is from Martin Luther King, that says, roughly, you know, he who is devoid of the power to forgive is devoid of the power to love. And, you know, I think that at the end of the day, miracles are really the language of the divine. I also think that they're on the lighter side. They certainly are a universal language. I mean, when people talk about miracles, they can talk about anything from finding a parking space outside of a store on Christmas Eve to, you know, the latest cure for hair loss. So, you know, miracles are something that we use outside of, you know, religious or spiritual conversations. Anyway.
I think that's true. And I mean, as you said, you know, you can find miracles anywhere. When I was reading your book, I had gotten, you know, someone I knew was going through a really tough time and I was a little despondent about it. And I'm reading your book and I was all, you know, and then all of a sudden I get a text from someone saying, oh, that person's doing a great job and this is all good. And I'm like, this is a little miracle for me. So it's really identifying it and seeing, you know, I think you have a quote in there that says there's so many miracles going on. You just have to find, you know, it's that not ignoring them. That's part of the journey.
Well, yeah, I mean, like we like to say that we're not the only ones that say this, but a lot of people say this or have said this. Miracles are really looking at the common in an uncommon way. And I think that that's what the Miracle Collectors offers, is a way to maybe change your perception, maybe even a full-on paradigm shift. And so, yeah. And so maybe we should get to some questions if we have any. And if not, Carrie, you and I should talk about what it's like to write with a partner.
Yeah.
I do have a question from Joanna. She says she lives in Boulder, Colorado, and this being such a hard week after the shooting on Monday, and she reread some of the chapters in your book, which helped bring her out of her gloom. So she's wondering what Katie and Joan do themselves when events bring them down.
Oh, wow. I guess the answer is what I've said before, which is that I think it is human to get really brought down by the events, for example, that just happened this week. One of the, you know, evil exists. There's not much question about that. And we have an opportunity when you can take a deep breath and you're ready. And obviously everybody has down days, to just shift the focus to, you know, goodness and wonder and beauty. And for me personally, immersing myself somewhere in nature is always, you know, sort of lifts my spirits and, you know, sucks me into just, you know, the wonder and beauty of nature. And so that's kind of what I do.
Any more questions, Allison?
Not yet, but if you guys have questions, definitely put them. Oh, wait, I'm sorry, there's one. Hey, Katie, Dan, have you ever experienced a wave of miracles?
I have because I'm always on the lookout. So, you know, I do. I see them everywhere. I really do. And, you know, I certainly have had the gift of a lot of miracles, you know, these last couple of weeks, because people have shared them with us. And it's not just, their stories don't just begin and end there. You know, they really have an effect on me, and they reinforce, like something Carrie said earlier, and that this idea of hope, that these stories give people hope, and they remind us that we're not alone. And that when I say that we're not alone, I personally believe that means that we're connected both to a higher power and that we're connected to each other, that we have a lot in common. So one story that, full disclosure, I think it's my friend Johanna that asked the question about Boulder. And one of the things that we haven't talked about today is this idea of being the miracle for somebody else. And this whole idea of, we don't have control over, you know, terrible things that can happen. But Joan and I both love the idea that, you know, since we don't have control, we like to pretend we do. And one of the ways we can do that is to be the miracle, because, you know, it beats waiting around for that thunderbolt from the sky, right? And so Johanna was sharing with me a story. Her husband owns a business. She and her husband own a business that supply radio equipment to the Boulder Police Department. And one of their commanders was at a memorial at the supermarket the other evening, and a 30-ish guy walked up to him and handed him an American flag and said that Officer Talley, I think was his name, who lost his life trying to save other people in that tragedy, that many, many years before, he had been, you know, out with alcohol, underage, drugs, whatever. And Officer Talley, rather than arresting him and his friends, gave them a fatherly talk about doing the right thing and, you know, sort of taking the right path. And he did. He changed his life that day. And he was so thankful that this man had done that for him. He just had to thank someone else who knew him. And that's why he showed up that night. But it really is this idea of that Officer Talley may never have known what a miracle he had been in this boy and then man's life. And also this idea that miracles ripple, that there's a ripple effect of miracles that go on and on and on. You know, Joan and I started telling our stories, and then people started telling their stories to us. And then, you know, it blossomed into this book.
Okay, we have another question from Tanya. She says, thank you for this wonderful discussion. I'm learning so much. I have a question about storytelling and listening. One of your amazing revelations in your book is how difficult it can be for people to share their stories. But in the book, you also talk about how, as a listener, one can encourage the sharing of these stories. Can you talk a little bit about how storytelling can be a two-way street? How can we as listeners lighten some of the burden for someone who maybe needs to tell their miracle story?
That is something that happens so organically for us, but I think a lot of it is that the sort of environment in which you're in. I mean, in our case, it gave people permission because we were talking about these stories, but I think the biggest piece of it is that when you are willing to tell your own story, you are putting yourself out there and willing to be vulnerable in that way. I mean, I think people like Brene Brown have made a big thing about being vulnerable. But I think vulnerability is something that starts to peel back the layers of this superficial, you know, social media projection that we're all so used to. And I think it's about mirroring what you would like in return. And so when you share a story, I think it's really important that when someone then says, gee, this happened to me, that this idea of empathic listening means that, you know, you don't start thinking about what you're going to say next or what your agenda might be, and you really allow the other person to tell their story and, you know, let the pregnant pause hang and let them keep going.
I think it's true also with any interviewer. You have to, what you just said, not be insistent to tell what you have to say and your agenda. You get the best information when you let people talk.
Okay, another question from Cullen. Katie, what's the biggest gift you've received from writing The Miracle Collectors?
Well, shout out to Cullen, who is my sister, who's with another sister, who's pulled over to the side of the road on their way to Santa Fe. So thank you guys for that. This entire experience, both, you know, this is surprising. I was, you know, watching a presentation last night that had Cheryl Strayed and another author that were being interviewed about writing. And writing this book, actually, I learned a lot from writing the book, because you have an idea, for example, for a chapter, and you think, oh gosh, you know, I have a whole paragraph is about all I really have to say. And then the next thing you know, you're going deeper and deeper and deeper. And so a lot of the times these stories that we heard, you know, were the gifts that, you know, allowed us to go deeper within ourselves to come up with this book. I think, you know, I can't speak for Joan, but that the writing itself is part of it. And then, like I mentioned earlier, from Rebecca, who I interviewed subsequently to her telling us the story, you know, I really learned something from her. And every story that I hear, like the guy the other night who told the story about his grandmother, I hadn't really thought about the fact that grief and tragedy, the logical human reaction is revenge and hatred. I mean, I think that's, you know, I think that's understandable. And that he put on the brakes towards going over that cliff and really talked about forgiveness in that way. So I learned more about forgiveness, even though we wrote a chapter on it. So I'm learning every day from the stories that we hear.
Katie, you think there's going to be a book 3?
You know, a lot of the interviewers are asking us what's our next step. And, you know, the truth is, this is our next step. You know, we're really appreciating talking about the book. And, you know, we have greatly accelerated the number of stories that we're hearing. So we have quite a few already in the 2 weeks just since we published the book. So, you know, it's certainly a possibility, but right now, Joan and I are really excited about talking about this book. And yeah.
But you have a blog as well where you put out, will you continue to put out other stories on that blog going forward?
Yes. So we have a website, themiraclecollectors.com. It would be fabulous if people, you know, visit us there. You can sign up for our monthly inspirational blog. You can listen to our Spotify playlist that's, you know, kind of loosely based on the book and every miracle song that we could possibly find. You can follow us on social media, and you can certainly buy the book.
That's good, definitely. And hopefully the library has it too.
The library in Hamptons, and really, you know, shout out to Hamptons for carrying the book. That's awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I don't know if there's anything you want to add. We have about 5 minutes. So and if you have some parting words for us, I really appreciate you taking this time. It was great.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you so much. I've done most of the talking. Carrie, do you have any parting words?
No, I think it's really exciting. And I'm glad I got to, you know, this is, as I said, this is a story that's resonated with me for life. And I'm glad that everybody got to hear it. And I encourage everybody to sort of, you know, think of miracles. And it's a really nice way to reframe your mind. If you look for, when you read this book, you really feel like you're looking for the joys in life and the little goodnesses that may seem that we take for granted, but they, you know, there's so much is a miracle. And I obviously spend my days writing about murder. So it's nice to look for the good things, because when I'm, you know, I mean, sometimes a miracle for me is if I really don't like someone, I can kill them off in a fictionalized version in my book. But for everyday reality, I can't do that. So I have to try and, you know, lead the better life, which this book is kind of inspirational. And it's, as I want to repeat, it's not a religious book. It's sort of just a spiritual book, an inspirational book. And it's actually a good book to just pick up. You know, you don't have to read it at once. You can read a chapter here and there, but to give it to someone who's having a hard time and, you know, try and be positive.
Well, thanks everybody who joined the call and the Zoom. And Carrie, thank you for organizing it and interviewing me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you all for coming. And now it's cocktail hour, so.
Yep, time to start the weekend. Allison, thanks again.
Bye guys, thanks for joining us. And thank you to Katie and Carrie. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.